A baby born today has over a 50% chance of being a centenarian. So we will continue to extend lifespan. But what about health span? What good is extending lifespan if by 80 years old you have a 40% chance of getting Alzheimer's disease? Your personality is going to be stolen from you, your memories, who you are. It's a thief of who you are. I just think it's the worst disease in the world. You live your whole life, kids, grandkids, family, memories of who you are, and then everything, all of your neuronal network, all of the synapses that define you as a person and your entire life map is stolen. So I just find this disease to be a totally unacceptable part of aging, and I won't stop until we cure it, and it can be cured.
Cure Alzheimer's Fund is funding research with, no question, some of the best researchers in the globe on Alzheimer's disease, which is higher risk but higher return if it succeeds. And there are no other sources for this kind of funding. Venture capitalists take higher risk. That's how you get a higher return. And I'm an impatient guy. We need to move quicker.
Most of the attention right now is directed on how to care for people with Alzheimer's. And my feeling is we need to go to the root of the problem, which is to stop the disease. The only way we're going to stop the disease is through medical research. I mean, it just seems really simple to me.
Our research consortium will make a proposal to us, and then we have a scientific advisory board of major scientists, including Paul Greengard, the Nobel Prize winner. And this scientific advisory board will look at this proposal and say, is it consistent with your roadmap, your objectives? Is it a good project? And if they sign off on it, then we as laymen will then fund it.
It's certainly wonderful that people are worried about support because people need it desperately with this terrible disease. But we wanted our money that we raised to go directly into research, especially since there's so much new genetic information that's being found which can be used to help figure out what a cure might be.
The whole field, thousands of labs have been working on the information garnered from 4 genes that we, the geneticists, gave them over the last 2 decades. And it's only 30% of the genetic puzzle. And so we sat here in my office and said, you know, what if we had the other 70%? The bottom line is that every single new gene we discover in the Alzheimer's Genome Project, funded by Cure Alzheimer's Fund, we get an enhanced ability to predict and diagnose the disease, and we get a new biological clue for what causes the disease, and most importantly, a clue for drug discovery.
The venture capital approach is not reactive. We don't sit at our desk and hope that the next founder of Google will send us a business plan. We're proactive. We go out and we look for and identify world-class talent in fields that we think are growth fields or fields that we'd like to invest in.
If you write a check, it goes directly to research. And the grants that we use with our researchers don't even cover overhead. They just cover the actual time in the lab that people are spending seeking results. That money, 100% is going to research.
The amount of misery and unhappiness that's taking place in the world because of this disease is so enormous that if we could actually find a cure, it would be tremendously rewarding. So it would be great if we could do it.
Let me add my welcome to everybody. Again, I'm Robert Bazell, and this is about memory in part. And for those of you who didn't read your pamphlets, and I don't expect you to, I'm a science and medicine reporter for NBC, and the reason that I raised that right at this moment is that when I came to Boston for this, and I live in New York, it suddenly hit me that it was almost 30 years ago today that I did my first report on Alzheimer's disease from here in Boston. It was one of the first network reports about it. And it was, other than the embarrassment of showing you a version of myself 30 years younger, I actually should have brought it and shown it to you, because I interviewed at the time in that piece 2 people who were still pioneers, and are still leaders in the field. Dennis Selko, who's still at the Brigham, and Marilyn Alpert, who was at Mass General and is now at Johns Hopkins. And Dr. Selko showed me a woman, elderly woman, and he said to her, I'm going to ask you to remember an address. He said, 76 Beacon Street, and he said, I'm going to ask you to repeat it. And she said, I've already forgotten it. And it was a very moving thing, because nobody had seen that. The people that I worked for and the people in the audience were amazed by that piece, because it was just at a time science had already caught on just in the last decades before that, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that the disease that you'll hear about in a minute, that was first described in 1901 by Dr. Alzheimer as a rare disease of relatively young people, was in fact the same disease that struck many of the older people. And it was also just starting to dawn on everybody that there were so many people living so much longer that we faced this tsunami of misery. And going back and thinking about what was said in that piece, it's amazing to me how much has not changed. We still have this disease. We still have that same curve that you're going to see and hear about, and I'm sure you all know about, that's going to take over the society. We still don't have any effective treatments. And yet we have this enormous amount of knowledge that you're going to hear about in a minute. So just that was my memory about Alzheimer's coming here 30 years ago. Like I say, I wish I had brought the tape with me, but it didn't occur to me till I got off the plane here in Boston. But I'm going to start by introducing the gentleman to your left, to my right, David Shenk, who wrote a book in 2001, and it was revised in 2003, which with all due respect to Rudy, the next person down who wrote another book about Alzheimer's, I think it's the best book about Alzheimer's. It's called The Forgetting, and it is an enormously helpful layperson's guide to the social, scientific, and all the other multitude of aspects of this horrible disease. So I'll give it to David.
Thank you, Bob. Yeah, we're competitors. That's how I think of myself and Rudy. It's tiny little differences that I sit in a room alone and write, and he's going to cure the most important disease known to mankind. So aside from that, we're virtually competitors. It's an honor to be here. Thank you to the Cure Alzheimer's Fund for letting me be a part of this. I have just recently discovered Cure Alzheimer's Fund, and I'm just blown away at what they're doing. And it's happening at a really, really important time. It's probably everyone in this room knows. So I wrote a book called The Forgetting about 10 years ago, as Bob said, and it was a history of the disease and a biography of the disease, explaining what it actually does to the brain and talking about the race to the cure. And this was at a really hopeful time. When I was writing the book, the first time I met Rudy, you probably won't remember, but it was in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and there was a conference going on there in 1999, and I had so many conversations with scientists where the smiles were up like this, and they were practically giddy with hopefulness. And I started to get frightened, honest to God, in a selfish way, that my book wasn't going to come out before we stopped Alzheimer's disease 11 years ago. That was my crazy little narcissistic fear that my career was going to get hurt by the cure of Alzheimer's. And that's how close it felt then that we were. And to put it in context, this is after not just a century of Alzheimer's disease being among us. That's how long the name has been with us. But Alzheimer's disease, as we know it, and as I discovered as I went back and talked to historians, this is a disease that has been a part of humankind as long as there is recorded history. We have written records of Egyptian gods that were supposed to come down with senile dementia, and Homer wrote about this, Aristotle, Plato, every famous author you can think about wrote about what we now call Alzheimer's disease, these same symptoms, this very slow disease that as we know it symptomatically, is about a 10 or 15-year ordeal, but really comes on, as we now know from the great science, even before that, it's really a disease that moves very, very slowly over many decades. And so we've been trying to understand it kind of loosely for, for a century, and then there's been, little bits of progress, and as you're going to hear about in just a few minutes, we've made even more progress. But I think, probably most people know in this room, it's been a very rocky 10 years. There have been some very hopeful events, but it's also been a troubling 10 years because we are now right at that cusp where we know for certain that the number of Alzheimer's cases is going to explode because it isn't really, although the disease has been with us for centuries and centuries, it's now really becoming an extraordinary problem because of longevity, as Rudy said in the film. It's always been with us, but we haven't lived long enough in great enough numbers to really suffer from it as a people. So we've always seen it as an individual tragedy. Now we're seeing it as a social catastrophe. And we have no choice but to stop this disease. I mean, most people are here because they're touched by the disease personally in one way or another, but you don't have to be touched by the disease personally. We can recognize now that everyone has a stake in stopping this disease. So with that said, I usually give talks about explaining the disease because the scientists are way too busy curing the disease to be talking about it. So I want to get out of the way as soon as possible. I do want to play just 1 minute of a film. After I wrote the book, we went out and we made a film for PBS called The Forgetting, and I've since been involved giving talks and making little films for the web to try to explain the disease, because as important as these guys are up here, really the dirty little secret behind the cure to Alzheimer's is it's got to involve everyone. You people in this room are ambassadors for going out and telling everyone else how important this disease is, raising money, raising awareness, getting the political wherewithal, and throwing just as many resources as we can at this terrible problem. So my job is to try to explain it so that we can all become ambassadors for the disease. And we're going to play just a minute of this film that kind of explains the very outlines of the disease, and then we'll get a little bit more granular.
What is Alzheimer's disease? Alzheimer's is a slow, fatal disease of the brain affecting 1 in 10 people over the age of 65. No one is immune. The disease comes on gradually as 2 abnormal protein fragments called plaques and tangles accumulate in the brain and kill brain cells. They start here in the hippocampus, the part of the brain where memories are first formed. Over many years' time, the plaques and tangles slowly destroy the hippocampus, and it becomes harder and harder to form new memories. Simple recollections from a few hours or days ago that the rest of us might take for granted are just not there. After that, more plaques and tangles spread into different regions of the brain, killing cells and compromising function wherever they go. This spreading around is what causes the different stages of Alzheimer's.
Okay, so that's just a little taste, and you'll hear much more in much more fine detail in a moment what this disease is. I just want to take another moment to say that I'm just really humbled to be here. We are really, honestly, in the presence of greatness. This is a historic time. We are going to stop this disease, where the people in this room represent really the core of an army that is going to do it. And we're going to need all of your help and all of your friends and family's help. So thank you for being a part of that cause. Thank you to the Cure Alzheimer's Fund for pushing this thing forward in a tremendous way, and thanks for letting me be here.
Thank you, David. The next speaker is one of the people who has benefited from what you people do, and I too want to add my thanks for it. He's one of the great scientists in Alzheimer's research. It's the Joseph and Rose Kennedy. You know, Joe Kennedy would not let his wife's name go first, like most people who endow research faculty positions let the wife's name go first, but Joe Kennedy, it's the Joseph and Rose Kennedy. Well, whatever. But at Massachusetts General Hospital, and Rudy has been at the forefront of the genetics, of finding the genetics of this disease, which is where many people, almost everyone who thinks about Alzheimer's thinks the effective treatments, let's hope a cure, are going to come from. So we'll have Rudy give a quick summary of his work and talk, but the question before you even start is, what is your estimate of the range of time that it could be between the minimum and maximum until there is an effective treatment? That means it's something that stops or slows the progression of Alzheimer's.
I guess I made the mistake in 2001 when I first met David in Santa Fe, along with everyone else, thinking 5 to 10 years at that time, because we knew what we had to do. We had the target, as I'll go through when I give my talk. We knew what we needed to do, and we thought how to do it, the process would be relatively easy. It turns out it's very difficult. It's tough to get drugs into the brain. It's tough to get drugs that are safe and ones that are potent. And most of the drugs that have been tried so far, although they have the right intention, they have the right target, they either don't get into the brain very well, they're not safe, or they're not very powerful. But I think we're still on the right track. So at the risk of being redundant, I still say 5 to 10 years, because I think that the new second and third wave of these drugs since 2001 that are now either in the clinic or in the pipeline are looking really good, especially 3 different types of drugs that Cure Alzheimer's Fund is funding right now.
And I'm going to ask you a second question, and I will let you get on with your presentation. Yeah. One of the themes that has come up in my reporting on Alzheimer's recently, and it seems to become something of a, well, there's 2 things that have become a mantra in my observation. One is that one of the reasons all the drugs have failed is that they weren't early enough in the disease process, and that the disease process of Alzheimer's begins as much as 20 years before there's any symptoms whatsoever. And therefore, we have to find people who have no symptoms but are on their way to becoming Alzheimer's, and those are the only people who are going to be treated. And that you hear that a lot from very prominent Alzheimer's researchers, and I want to know what your opinion is of that idea. And I have a second question.
Yeah, I think that opinion is valid, but a bit overblown as an excuse for why the drugs failed. Honestly, I think the therapies that have failed so far failed because they weren't very good. They weren't safe, they didn't get into the brain, or they weren't potent. So yes, we want to treat early, but I think some of the drugs that, even the ones that we're working on, can treat the disease once the disease starts as well. Our goal is to stop it before it actually starts. But there are new drugs in the pipeline right now that can actually treat in early to mid-stage patients. So I hear that a lot, that we need to treat earlier, and I can't disagree with it. But I don't think that's the main reason why the drugs failed. The drugs that were tried so far just weren't very good.
And the second, and my last question before I let you go on with your presentation, you were co-author on a paper recently that showed that the same gene is responsible for both insulin resistance, which of course is the hallmark of type 2 diabetes, and for the accumulation of a chemical you're going to hear a lot about in a minute called beta amyloid in the brain. You heard about it in David's film. The question is, does the relationship between type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's, which is also shown up in some epidemiological studies, mean that this horribleness of a wave of Alzheimer's disease could be even greater than we know if something isn't done about it?
Yeah, I think the diabetes-Alzheimer's link is very important. Back in 2000, we had a paper, Science, showing that the insulin-degrading enzyme, which is the enzyme that breaks down insulin, so in the body, was also an Alzheimer's gene. And then more recently with Sam Gandy, we found another gene that's involved with both Alzheimer's and diabetes. And I always thought the connection was just that the same enzyme that breaks down insulin also has to break down the amyloid in the brain, and it was a competition. And we recently did an experiment in mice where we knocked out their insulin-degrading enzyme, And then we crossed those mice with Alzheimer's mice, and we thought the mice should get worse, right? Because that enzyme should also break down the amyloid. The mice actually got better. So now I'm rethinking that maybe the link to diabetes does have more to do with insulin itself and the power, the energy it actually provides to the brain. So we're rethinking the link more toward insulin itself.
So I'm sorry, just to finish that question, what does that mean? What does the public health implication of that rethinking mean?
Well, to me, it just means that when we think about, again, with the goal of preventing Alzheimer's before it starts, that reducing the risk for diabetes, meaning metabolic disease, so adjusting your diet, exercise, et cetera, obesity, trying to reduce risk for diabetes will go just as far for reducing risk for Alzheimer's and, in fact, heart disease. I mean, as I'll say at the end of my talk, the answer is always physical exercise, good diet, and keep learning. So I think that you have common risk factors between the two, and that's why you see comorbidity between diabetes and Alzheimer's. Rob also has information on the diabetes link, which is quite different.
Yeah, I'll talk about this towards the end of my talk, but we've just discovered an astonishing link between diabetes and Alzheimer's disease that's based around A-beta and another peptide called amylin. It turns out type 2 diabetes is an amyloid disease. It's diabetes is a different amyloid, different peptide, but very similar in a lot of ways. And you could say that diabetes is really Alzheimer's of the pancreas. And the key here is that it looks like from our stuff that they both have the same function, which is a very unexpected one. But we'll get to that.
Okay, let's get to Rudy. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm going to go here. So thank you all for being here today and for supporting Alzheimer's and our cause. I want to thank the Cure Alzheimer's Fund and the founders, and Tim and the staff. I want to thank Bob and David for being here. This is a great event, and the idea is to tell you a little bit today about how far we've come in trying to eradicate Alzheimer's. I like to use that word, as I'll show you. And very much thanks to the support that the Cure Alzheimer's Fund has provided, not only to my lab, but to labs around the country. So I want to start with a series of numbers. 40 corresponds to the % of people who will have Alzheimer's disease after 85 years old. 72 corresponds to every 72 seconds, there's a new diagnosis of Alzheimer's in this country. And 400 is the differential between how much we spend on Alzheimer's care in this country, about 180 billion, and how much we spend on research, just over 400 million. So that doesn't make much sense. 2015 refers to the year which Jeff Morby calculated, somewhere between 2015 and 2020, the tipping point will occur, where with 71 million baby boomers headed toward risk age for Alzheimer's, that it will start to single-handedly topple and collapse Medicare and Medicaid. So this is a critical time coming up, and we don't have much time to actually stop this disease. And can anybody guess what zero refers to? That's right, therapy. Zero refers to how many therapies we currently have to stop the disease. As you probably know in this room, we have sets of drugs that treat the symptoms, that provide temporary benefit and help to enhance cognition modestly, but we do not have drugs that actually stop the disease process. So what do we do about this? Well, let me start with just some information about Alzheimer's. Some people ask, what's the difference between dementia and Alzheimer's disease? And Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia in the elderly. So there are many different reasons for dementia. It can be organic and can be other forms of disease like Pick's disease and frontal lobe disease, but Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia. And we have, like I said, no effective treatments for stopping the disease. The risk factors include, number one, age. It's now estimated with how long we live, which is roughly till about 80, that 1 in 5 persons over 65 will get Alzheimer's disease in their lifetime. And that the prevalence of Alzheimer's basically doubles every decade after 60 years old. So then you're up to about 40 or 50% over the age of 85. The second greatest risk factor, and this is what got my attention when I started studying Alzheimer's, 30 years ago now, just about, actually 30 years ago, was that family history plays a very key role, that genetics plays a key role in this disease. If you look at twin studies and family studies, 80%, minimally, 80% of Alzheimer's cases involve inherited factors and genetics. If you have a family history of Alzheimer's, your risk is higher than someone who does not. If we look at life exposure risk factors, traumatic brain injury is a risk factor. We talked about metabolic disease risk factors like diabetes, high cholesterol, obesity. Stroke, neurovascular events are a risk factor. More recently, social isolation, sitting at home being lonely, not getting out, is a risk factor for this disease. And I include now as a risk factor birth, because the thing is, if we all live till 120 years old, you can argue that almost without exception, we will all have enough pathology, plaques and tangles in our brain to start at least the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. After 40 years old, we are all forming plaques and tangles. It's part of how we're living our lives. Maybe we're doing something fundamentally wrong. Maybe this is meant to be. I don't know. But that doesn't mean we can't stop it and eradicate it. And the way we need to do this is by using genetics to predict who's at risk, early detection of the disease with biomarkers and imaging, and most importantly, empowering those who are on their way to get this disease with drugs that will stop it. So what is this disease? And you heard a little bit from David that basically, since Alzheimer described the disease in the early 1900s and all the way up to 1986, we could just describe the disease based on its pathology. There were plaques, which are these clumps of material outside the nerve cells. There are tangles that choke the inside of the nerve cells. Dr. Alzheimer described those in his patient. And the brain actually starts to shrink. You start to lose nerve cells. You lose the connections between the nerve cells. But for 80 years or so, all we could do was describe the aftermath of the disease. So I used to say it's kind of like somebody wants to understand a game of football, and there was a Patriots game at 1 o'clock, and they go to Gillette Stadium at 5. It's kind of hard to figure out what went on. So everything changed once we found the genes, and I was very lucky in my life to work on the first project that ever found the disease gene, which was Huntington's, together with Jim Gasella. We were really the first ones to do this type of work back in between 80 and 83. And then for my thesis work at Harvard, I switched to Alzheimer's disease, and along the way discovered the three familial early onset genes, what are called APP, presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and then the late onset gene that's known as called ApoE, which was discovered at Duke University. But these 4 genes, as I explained to the founders of Cure Alzheimer's Fund years ago, really have taught us, at least 95 or 99% of everything we know about the cause of Alzheimer's. So before the genes, we were just kind of dancing in the dark. We had no idea what was going on. Then the genes basically started to tell us what's going on. So let me show you what they showed us. So this is the idea again, that we use these genes for early prediction, early detection, early prevention, stop the disease before it strikes, actually eradicate it. And this is how we do it. By studying these 4 genes, they provide us with targets for drug discovery. When you try to come up with a therapy to treat a disease, you have to have a drug target. And when you have a drug target, you have to know where to choke it. You have to know where to go in there and stop something. Most drugs don't enhance something, they stop something that will then help you beat the disease, prevent it, or treat it. So this is how we go from genes to drugs in a very generalized way. So let me give you an example. Heart disease, okay? This started with a genetic, what really broke open heart disease were genetic studies. Brown and Goldstein, who won the Nobel Prize, found people who had heart disease at a very, very early age. These were folks who were dying of heart disease at 30, 40 years old. And they found genetic mutations in these people. And does anybody know what those mutations did in these people? They raised something very high, cholesterol. So same story there, right? Rare mutations, but they broke open heart disease. They said, Brown and Goldstein said, we believe high cholesterol is the issue. So what they did was they targeted cholesterol. Don't turn it off, you need cholesterol, but turn it down to a safe level. So as a result, statins came around, Lipitor, Pravastatin. Let me ask, how many people in this room take some form of a statin? So that's amazing, right? That's why incidence of heart disease is down. I mean, we can tell people exercise, don't eat the extra piece of pizza. I love pizza, I'm Italian, so I take a statin. But we need a statin for Alzheimer's disease.
Rudy, let me interrupt you for
Sure.
1 second. Wasn't the first statin discovered by a Japanese chemist who was just screening a whole bunch of compounds, and it was even before Brown and Goldstein's genetic work?
Yeah, it was retrofitted. Yes.
Yeah.
See, Bob knows this stuff. I got to be careful.
So it wasn't, I only want to point it out because nature, as we found out in the last decade, can be much more complicated than we want it to be.
Right.
And in fact, the statins were found before the story was
Right.
known.
So, but these were retrofitted to the idea that the target was cholesterol. Well, maybe we'll have a drug that already exists that will hit in Alzheimer's as well. Actually,
Dimabon looked like that for a while.
yeah.
And it didn't.
Actually, we may have one that Cure Alzheimer's Fund is funding. So we need the equivalent of a statin for Alzheimer's disease. What is our target? Our target's a little tiny protein called A-beta, or amyloid beta protein. It's a tiny protein or peptide that's made throughout the body, but in the brain, it accumulates. It accumulates with every decade of life. And I'm going to tell you in my talk why A-beta is a bad guy and why we have to hit it with drug therapies. But then you're going to hear from Rob's talk why A-beta is actually a good guy. And it turns out, just like cholesterol, you don't want to wipe it out. You want to just bring it down to a safe level. And it'd be great if we can come up with a drug that will do that to lower the incidence of Alzheimer's, just like we have for heart disease. So A-beta is made as this little protein and in the brain normally, but if you make too much of it, or if it starts to clump up, it's difficult for the brain to clear it out and get rid of it, and it starts to accumulate. So by 40 years old, we all accumulate a certain amount of this A-beta in the brain, and it's called beta amyloid. Beta amyloid is present as senile plaques, which Alzheimer first described, and you also see the beta amyloid around the blood vessels of the brain. And what we know is that beta amyloid then triggers Alzheimer's disease. But to trigger it, it has to cause the formation of what are called tangles. The tangles are made up of another protein called tau, and the tangles choke the inside of the nerve cells, and that's how the nerve cell dies. So if you think about what Alzheimer's really is, it's a disease where the tangles inside the nerve cells completely decimate the neural network and lead to cognitive changes, but amyloid is what gets you there. Amyloid accumulates and triggers the disease, but tangles have to finish the job and kill the nerve cells. So we have a multi-step process. What the genes have taught us, all of the genes revolve around amyloid. So let me just show you. This is a figure from a science piece that Cure Alzheimer's Fund just did, showing what it really looks like in the membrane. And I don't have a, maybe I could do it with this, but this guy, this protein here is where the amyloid beta protein comes from, and these guys are the enzymes that clip it. So you get a little clip here and a clip here. This piece gets released, and then if it accumulates too much, you get the plaques, and you get little pieces of these clumps,